It's 4 o'clock. I think we should begin. So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. It's nice to see a pretty full room on 4 o'clock on the halfway through World Water Week. I don't know how tired you're all feeling, but we're going to try and give you some new energy. My name's Dave Tickner. I work for the freshwater program in WWF based out of the UK. I'd also like to introduce my colleague Lucy Polhill, who will be helping with the moderation for this session. The purpose of this session is really to explore how we might generate more attention to and action on the global crisis in river health. We hope it's going to be an insightful session, hopefully a thought-provoking session, but also a bit of fun. We don't want to take it too seriously, and there's going to be a little bit of role-playing. But don't be nervous. It's these guys who have to play the roles, not you. I'd like to start by just spending a few minutes to kind of set the context for the discussion. I imagine many of you are familiar with this kind of thinking. Peter Drucker was a 20th century Austrian-American management consultant and theorist, and he's often credited with coming out with this idea that if you want to manage something, you have to measure it. And conversely, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. I imagine many of you in this room have come across that kind of thinking in your work. It's part of the reason we all have to deal with KPIs and indicators and monitoring and so on. And undoubtedly, it's led to a lot of effort in the water sector generally, the conservation sector generally, in order to help us understand the situation in the world and track what progress we are or aren't making addressing conservation issues. Over the last 40 or so years, this kind of thinking has led to a real sort of effort in many parts of the world to improve monitoring of river health, to improve the indicators we have to understand river health at the local level, the national level, the international level. And there's been some work recently, which Chris and myself and others have been involved in, really to try to learn some lessons from some of those efforts over the last 40 years, but also to set a pathway to try to improve global scale monitoring of river health, but also to feed into better local scale monitoring of river health. But there is another way of thinking about things. Zelda Fitzgerald was an early 20th century American novelist, painter, socialite. And she came out with this, I think, rather lovely quote. "Nobody has ever measured, not even poets," she said, "how much the human heart can hold." Some things just can't be measured. Does that mean they're not important? Does that mean they shouldn't be managed or improved in some way? There's substantial research from the social and cognitive sciences that just measuring things, communicating indicators, communicating facts and figures, actually doesn't do that much to engage people in conservation issues, in river health issues. And actually there are other things we need to do as well, maybe even instead, to try to get people to think about issues like river health, to get them to engage, to get them to invest their time, their energy, and maybe their money to try to address the issues. And in particular, getting people emotionally connected with rivers and other freshwater ecosystems seems to be emerging as a really important issue. So, what should we do if we want to raise the profile of river health as a global sustainability priority, alongside tropical forests, alongside the health of the oceans, alongside climate change? Should we invest in better data, better indicators, better monitoring? Or should we tell better stories? That's the question we'd like to explore with this session. And of course, rivers are in crisis globally. We know this. It's not entirely a bleak story, but when we look at the global picture, we see massive changes in river connectivity as a result of construction of water infrastructure like dams or flood levees. Fewer than a third of the world's longest rivers are now free-flowing from source to sea because of this, and that has major impacts on ecosystem health. We know that pollution from a bewildering array of sources is affecting river health and human health in many parts of the world. We know that water scarcity is an issue, and although it's We're still lacking sort of reliable global analyses of what that means for river flows. If we take water scarcity generally as a proxy for how river health is being affected by water use and over abstraction, then that's a pretty bleak picture as well. And we know that all of this is playing out in terms of impacts on wildlife and biodiversity. So the graph on the bottom right of this slide shows WWF's Living Planet Index for freshwater wildlife, which shows an 83% decline, pretty much tracking my lifetime. Not that it's all my fault, of course. So there is a global crisis in river health. Now, what's this session going to do? Well, we're going to have two entrepreneurs present a couple of big ideas to a panel of dragons. And each of these dragons, I'd like you to imagine, has a pot of $50 million that they could invest in initiatives to raise the profile of river health and to generate action to improve river health. And they have to make decisions about how they're going to invest that $50 million. So I'll introduce our dragons now, and I'll introduce our entrepreneurs each just before they speak. So we have Alan Townsend. Alan's an interdisciplinary water expert. He has an engineering and social science background. He's worked at the intersection of agriculture, energy, and health. He's advised sitting US ambassadors, Fortune 100 companies, and at the moment he co-leads the Science-Based Target Network's Freshwater Hub. So works a lot with companies who are interested in investing in this kind of thing. For the purposes of today, I'd like you to imagine that Alan is actually representing a consortium of companies who have allocated collectively $50 million to invest in improving river health as a means of addressing their water risks and their ESG priorities. Next to Alan, we have Stuart Crane. Stuart works for UNEP and has extensive experience in the not-for-profit sector, working on freshwater monitoring, ecosystems management, climate adaptation, and access to climate finance. He's currently the global coordinator for SDG 6 monitoring and directly supports UN member states in tracking and reporting their national progress. For the purposes of today's session, I'd like you to imagine Chris would actually quite like this job in real Stuart would actually quite like this job in real life, I think. He's representing a new UN agency for ecosystems and people set up by the UN Secretary General as a legacy project and backed by a number of European development agencies. Next to Stuart, we have Yara Bueno Giacomini. Yara is currently Director of River Basin Rehabilitation, working on access to water and multiple use of water resources in the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in Brazil. She has a background in conflict management and cooperation, a technical background in water governance, limnology and oceanography, and though she currently works at the national level on policy issues, she has substantial experience working on the ground in river basins and at the state level in Brazil. For the purposes of this conversation, I'd like you to imagine that Yara has been appointed as the incoming director of a new fund for South-South cooperation on river basin management, with a brief to make a significant change on pollution, water scarcity, and ecosystem degradation. Our three dragons, everybody. So, without further ado, what I'd like you to do is get your phones out, because there's going to be a little bit of audience participation on this. So either scan the QR code or go to menti.com and access this code, and there will be a question there for you. We're asking this question about your own experiences of engaging different stakeholders on issues around river health. We'd like to particularly know whether you've used primarily data, indicators, monitoring, whether you've used narratives and storylines and perhaps more emotionally engaging approaches, whether you've used both, or perhaps whether you've used neither. Can we switch to the Mentimeter slide now? Let's have a look. How's that working? Numbers are gently going up and down, but okay, there's perhaps a slight bias towards narratives and stories, which I have to say I'm a bit surprised at, but kind of encouraged by. But quite a few people have said you've used both of the above, which is also quite encouraging. because of course both are important. Okay, we're going to come back to this at the end of the session as well, just to see what you think after having heard our entrepreneurs and our dragons debate the issue. But without further ado, I think what we'll do is move on to hear from our first entrepreneur. Chris Dickens is an aquatic ecologist working with the International Water Management Institute, based in Sri Lanka. He has worked most of his career on river health issues, largely in South Africa, where he helped establish a national river health monitoring scheme. He's also worked at the international level, particularly being engaged with, is it fair to say, varying degrees of success in establishing effective monitoring schemes for sustainable development goals. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and dragons. I would like to present to you the concept of indicators for river health monitoring and to show you quite convincingly just how important they are, so that obviously you buy into this. So what is river health? We all have an intrinsic understanding of what your own health is. And as it says there, the general definition is your state of well-being. If all your limbs are present and your head is in the right place and your limbs are functioning well and your guts are functioning well, you're healthy. And we can determine that because we can measure it. And there's a definition which you can read there of the health of an ecosystem. And you can see it requires the functionality of the ecosystem to be intact and also the communities. And again, in order to know whether all of that is actually intact, as observers, we need to be able to measure it. We need to be able to measure the function of the ecosystem and also, obviously, the biodiversity. So if we were to take a selection of indicators to describe what would be the health of a river, that's the publication which Dave showed on one of the early slides, which we recently published. That's pretty much represented by that figure there. On the right-hand side, you can see there are a number of what we call driver indicators, things like the flow of water and the basic chemistry of the water, the connectivity of the rivers, whether dams are breaking the flow of the river, et cetera, all of those in the brown slices. Those are sort of driver indicators, but they are indicators. And then on the left-hand side, you've got, in the blue, you've got response indicators, the biodiversity issues, the fish and the invertebrates, and so on. And then in the middle, we've got primary productivity, which basically brings all of that together. And a slight detractor down the bottom, there are invasive species which might be taking away from that river health. And really, all of that needs to be together to have a fully functional ecosystem. Without any one of those pieces, things start to go wrong. When it comes to actual monitoring, we have some challenges when you're talking about a global system of monitoring. The ones I put a cross through are the ones where you basically have to go on site to get the data. The ones on without the cross, you can get a lot of information from the Earth observation. But quite uniquely, the ones on the left, we just at the moment have to go onto the ground. And it's one of the really big challenges. The whole world is moving over to reliance on Earth observation for collecting data. It just isn't going to cut it. And I don't know what's going to need to change for us to be able to collect those kinds of information from satellites, but at the moment we can't. Something like eDNA is just a glimmer of a possibility, but that's still not quite the same thing. So that's one of our challenges, is that we need to actually be able to reconcile the data that you collect on the ground and improve it and then link it to Earth observation data. This is an example of an Earth observation data collection with river connectivity. Very, very nice. It tells a lovely picture, and it'd be quite easy for countries just to fall back on that and show, well, that's the state of the river based on connectivity. But like if you go back to the pie diagram, it's only a very small part of the story. So we need to get onto the ground. And then you've got things like the fish and the invertebrates and so on. It all takes time, and it's complex, and it's expensive as well. I just want to sort of introduce the concept of what we call here an ecological classification. And this is now being very widely used because just like when you take your temperature to determine your own health, you can actually, based on how far out you are from normal, you would know whether you've got a real problem or just a slight problem. In the same way here, the blue, the A, represents a perfect natural condition, and a B is slightly off, and a C is more off, etc., right the way down to an E when it's all down and everything has gone completely rotten. And that kind of a classification is now very widely accepted, and you can see it represented here in a part of South Africa, the map on the right, where the different catchments in the basin have been represented by the colors representing the health of the ecosystem. That, by the way, was based only on invertebrate monitoring. So sometimes we use something like just the invertebrates as a proxy for overall river health, because if the invertebrates are in good condition, chances are the river's pretty good as a whole, but you do get some oopses where it doesn't quite work. This is the EU Water Framework Directive, the same classification scale on the left, and you can see it's broken down into separate investigations of the biological and the biophysical and the chemical, and then they evaluate each of those, and their particular way of monitoring is that the one that wins is the one that gets carried through. There's the New Zealand program, again a mixture of biodiversity and physical biochemical processes, etc. So the solutions that we need if we actually want to bring about global river health monitoring, first of all, we have to consciously adopt it. We have to make a decision we're going to adopt river health monitoring, particularly starting at a local level, but right the way through to a global level. We've got to then include the functionality of using the status of a river, whether it's sort of A, B, C, D, as part of your management objectives. And it's really useful, and in many countries they do this, where you actually, in advance, you write into regulations that a particular river needs to be maintained in either a B or a C or a D, whatever level you require. If it's in, for example, downstream of a city, you're not going to ever get it to an A category, so you accept maybe it's a C, and then you put that into regulations, and then you manage towards that. So it becomes a very useful objective for management. But then we need to set up the monitoring, and we need indicators, and which is my main point here. We really need indicators to measure whether river health is okay or not. And we've got to select sites, and we've got to select and then get on with implementation. And then at a global level, we've got to collect local reports, because as I mentioned earlier, much of the information you have to collect locally. So we've got to collect the global reports, and somehow we've got to aggregate it into a global map and a global representation of river health. So essentially, Dragons, I'm seeking funds for the following. Is firstly to sort out what are the most suitable indicators for global monitoring. This collection of both local and global data. And then I would also like the funding to help to build a global support for the implementation of the monitoring program, and then actually initiate it. Somebody needs to pull the trigger and start the whole global river health program. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Chris. Straight on then to our second entrepreneur, Julia Martin Ortega. Julia is Professor of Ecological Economics at the University of Leeds, where she's also Associate Director of Water at Leeds, one of the largest interdisciplinary water research hubs in the world. Julia has more than 20 years of experience of interdisciplinary research herself, and most of her research seeks to further the understanding of relationships between communities or individuals with water ecosystems. She's part of several international scientific panels, been consulted by the UN Special Rapporteur on Water and Human Rights, has advised the UK's Climate Change Committee, works very closely with the World Bank, among many other things. Julia.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you everybody for being here. It's a real pleasure. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to tell you a story. Okay, and the story it's the story of how through history we have transformed the relationship that humans we have with rivers. Okay, so in the beginning, in the prehistorical times, there was personhood and animism. This means that, the hunter and gatherers, they did not really control their environment. They related in mutual terms with the environment. Agency and intention and personhood was not restricted to humans. Nature had a soul. And in this context, rivers were kin, they were family, they were brothers and sisters to the people who lived there. As we move through history and as agriculture, we have settled agriculture, control started, so we started to control nature. The agency of nature and the rivers diminished, and also we start to have gods in human forms, and hierarchy started to establish between the gods, the humans, and nature. Fast forward a lot, and then you have the 18th and 19th century, so you have the scientific and technological revolution. You also have colonialism. So what happened is that nature became something controllable, something knowable, something that we could control, and it became the thinkification of the world. The entire world became the heart of colonialism by the European elites. Also, we had neoclassical economics, in which we started to exchange anything and everything, and everything became exchangeable for money. And then we keep moving forward. We have this modern notion of water, in which we map it, we control it, we quantify it, we measure it, but also it becomes controllable through infrastructure, but it also becomes political. It actually becomes formally recognized in the 90s as an economic good, and even in some cases, a commodity that gets exchanged for money. So this process, this overriding philosophical, technological, economic, political process, very strongly moves from us relating to rivers as kin, as family, to becoming a thing, that we relate to it as a thing. Now, what we argue from our team is that this logic, this transformation is to a very large extent responsible to this global crisis that we have with water. Now, obviously, this is a global problem, as David and Chris have pointed out, but I'm just going to pick up on the example of the UK, where I live now. And I don't know if you're aware of, these are all pieces from the media from very, very recently, like 2 months ago, 1 month ago. I don't know if you know, but the water sector generally in the UK is in an absolute catastrophic moment at the moment. It's just literally failing structurally everywhere. So this is, and for not for a reason, the UK is sort of the cradle of this process of industrialization, scientific revolution, colonialism, capitalism. So, is the paradigmatic example of this model of transformation. Now, what we argue is that maybe we can reverse this trend, this crisis, by walking back from river as a thing to river as kin, again, as family. We have coined this term, river kin. We define kin in this context as the constituents of the environment that we reciprocally nurture each other, and they become the substance of each other's well-being. And obviously, this is something that will resonate. I'm talking about the mainstream here, but there's obviously a lot of this in context of, for example, the indigenous-led struggles in New Zealand, Canada, Australia for the recognition of personhood of rivers. Also, for example, in Ecuador, the enforceable rights of nature being made into the constitution. Colombia recognizing Mother Earth as part of the as enforceable right as well. But what we argue is that while we tend to think, oh, this is very nice, this is happening in some places where the indigenous footprint is still very visible, but we argue that actually there are traces of river kin everywhere. And if we go back to the UK, which again will be the paradigmatic example of having gone all the way to the thinkification, we do find it everywhere. So we find, for example, there's traces of river kin in the names of our towns. There's a lot of towns with the holy well terms on it. But there also, for example, nature-based well-being is becoming a very strong movement as well, for example, while swimming. Also, there's been examples of community movements for achieving some protection to the rivers, like the bathing status for rivers, successful campaigns. There's even been in the UK, for example, and in other countries. I come from Spain originally. We also have this in Spain, rights of nature campaigns to try to, again, give legal personhood to river, but also more generally, there's a general policy drive for nature-based solutions, which could be also conceived as a way of changing the narratives. So no, River King is not something that is happening in some places, which is still there's indigenous footprint strongly, but it can happen everywhere. And this is what we want to argue on these dragons. This is what I want to propose to you, is that we change course and we move from this modern water of concept to River King. This is a conceptualization in which kinship with rivers becomes part of the definition of river health, in which we recognize that we relate. We have a relational connection with rivers, that we have a mutualistic relation, and we acknowledge that we have plural values for rivers. And I would argue that we need to do that beyond data and metrics. We need to do this around narratives, a narrative-based relation with river. The reason why I'm saying this, and it's very interesting because, Chris here was saying a couple of times, this is only part of the story. Why do we keep making reference to story? It's because we are story animals. We understand the world through stories. We can actually not escape storytelling, as the philosopher Donna Haraway was saying. So I would argue that we need to tell a different story now. If we keep telling ourselves that rivers are a thing, and it was just enough to just measure that thing, then that's how we're going to relate to rivers. What I will argue is that we need to change the story. We need to start relating to rivers as our family, as kinship. So my plea, Dragons, is the following. I would like to get money from you to invest into a transformative participatory program to develop the notion of River King, this concept, into something practical, to give it a practical meaning in reality as a way of addressing river health. So I want to co-construct with communities this practical meaning for River King. I want to collectively explore ways in which kinship can actually drive efforts for river health, not just be part of it, but drive it, and also be able to embed narrative-based representation of how we relate to rivers into river health monitoring programs, so that together we can lead into a wider sector transformation beyond just the health of some river stretches. So essentially, I want you to invest in us writing up a new story. Thank you very much.
Julia, Chris, thank you very much. Two great presentations, and within time as well, which is a tribute in itself. Right, this is where the fun starts. We've got our two big ideas. We've got an idea to build a much more consistent, much more comprehensive global to local system of river health monitoring as a way of guiding investment in action to restore the health of our rivers. And we've got an idea to rekindle, if you'll pardon the pun, the idea of river kinship as a way of engaging people much more in the health of our rivers. So now I'm going to turn to our dragons. This is where they're going to get tough, I hope. And it's also where I might lose control of proceedings. So, I have no idea what these dragons are going to ask. I imagine, and the kind of things that I've asked them to think about are around, obviously, any questions or concerns they might have about Julia's or Chris's pitches. Anything in there that excites them. Any kind of gaps in the market where they're thinking, actually, this could really fill that gap. But in particular, if you've got $50 million, you don't just want to give it away, do you? You want some kind of return on your investment. And given who the dragons are, that's not just financial return. We're talking about social, environmental, perhaps some economic return as well. Those are the kinds of questions I'd ask, but these guys have got minds of their own, I think. So, dragons, over to you. Ali.
All right. Thank you for that terrific introduction. And I just really want to thank Chris and Julia for the enlightening presentations. I think I would start with Chris, and then perhaps, I don't know, we can exchange questions here. But Chris, I'm curious for you, from your work in the indicators, you mentioned it seems like there's kind of a suite of indicators that are out there. And I'm wondering how much, with this investment, do you imagine they would align both locally, regionally, and globally? And is there like a mix of indicators, or is there like a suite or a menu of those? And then how might those indicators align with other kind of global initiatives? We talked about freshwater biodiversity, corporate water stewardship, and things like that. So perhaps maybe a two-part question: how the indicators align internally and then externally in the water space.
Before you answer that, Chris, can I just ask, have we got a second mic that we could bring up here? Hi, guys at the back. Have we got a second mic, roving mic we can bring up? That would be great. Thanks. Go, Chris.
So, you know, as I did explain, it's really necessary to have the whole suite of things. And yet, because, as indicated, some of them are really hard to monitor, particularly the biodiversity inclined indicators, they very often get left off. And so, you know, for example, in the SDG, in 6.6, the bulk of the indicators revolve around quantity of water, the spatial distribution of water, and a touch of water chemistry, and no biodiversity. And now, because that's data which is globally accessible, it's convenient, and it produces an outcome for SDG monitoring, which is important. But there will always be this doubt that you haven't actually told the final story, because maybe all the biodiversity has been scrubbed by something else which you haven't monitored. And so it's really necessary to bring the biodiversity in. And unfortunately, so you talk about alignment, but you have to have a contribution from the local level, collecting biodiversity, which needs to merge with that global data. And it's too convenient just to rely on those large data sets.
Maybe I could go to Yara just on that sort of local level stuff, because Yara, you've worked at that level. And now you're operating at this much grander sort of international level with this South-South cooperation. Do you really need the local level stuff to build motivation and action at the policy level and investment for river health? Is Chris on a bit of a pipe dream there?
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for having you all here. I would say yes, it's quite important to involve the local level. Once normally the local knowledge and local documents and all the movements has been neglected by the international governance around the water. I told you I have been there for 13 years and I have never received anything about the international level on water governance. All the movements happening on the international level never reached me. In the São Paulo state, which is the most developed from Brazil. So yeah, and I feel happy listen the two proposals by one side, but for another, I feel a bit frustrated at the same time. And I feel happy because I agree with the importance of both narratives that you bring here, and I feel frustrated because both of them in somehow polarize and separate the RWRM that we talk a lot. And why I'm saying this? Because as I have technical backgrounds in limnology and oceanography, I know the numbers and the data per se do not change anything. I have been on this arena. I have tried for several years talking with mayors, with decision-maker politicians, and it didn't change. That's why I went to study water governance and management and conflicted management as well. So in this sense, how do you see that your proposals can bring something in the field of innovation that could bring on board the other actors? And how can we use this to really influence the decision makers? Another point is that the narratives are great and we need them for sure to create this awareness and bring people to the table to discuss. But when you go further and say, okay, which actions are we talking here when you are really going to implement and use them? Do you have this very clear?
Maybe, Yara, I'll stop you at those 2 points, if that's okay, because it sounds like you want Chris to re-justify the whole premise of his pitch. Indicators change nothing, is a paraphrasing of what you've said. And then you're also saying to Julia, I have no idea what you want me to invest in. You know, how do you make this practical in a way? So I'd like to hear a little bit from our entrepreneurs on those 2 issues. You go first, Julia.
Okay, I'll go first. So with the first, I'll just make a comment on the first question, but then it's more for Christopher. But I just want to make the point that, you know, the last point of my investment plea was precisely to have, you know, together with a range of stakeholders. River King can only work if it's with a range of stakeholders, because there's no point of me going to a nice area, talk to the, you know, local residents, come with lovely ideas about what River King can be, and I'll comment on that in a moment. If you know, I don't engage with the industry, I don't engage with the people who then have to take practical decisions about management. So in my investment plan, there is a stakeholder, it's all throughout. But I'll let Chris defend his part. Then on the practical thing, I knew this question was coming, right? Because River King, it sounds like very nice, right? I think everybody can like the idea, but then what does it mean in practice? And I think it would be wrong for me to say what it means in practice, because it's precisely, however, you know, it's about what people feel about water and how they relate to that. So I don't think I'm the one who has to say what it is, and that's why I'm proposing this, you know, collective understanding of practical meaning. However, because I knew you were going to hear something a little bit practical, when I started thinking about this one, the example that comes more strongly and more evidently is the one I have already mentioned, which is the legal personhood. This is recognizing that rivers or nature in itself has a right, it has the right to be defend itself in court, has to have, it's a subject, an active subject of legal rights. So that was the evident example when I came in, but I keep trying to not just be thinking about legal personhood. I don't want River King to translate in this is just about giving legal rights to the thing. So I'm actually wanting to see examples. For example, if you start paying attention, and I sort of give you this homework if you want, from now on when you start reading the news, just try to see if you see River King in things that you read. And recently I read one example about, from Spain, which is where I'm from, in which a bunch of people have started an initiative in one little village in Spain by which they actually made the mandate of the city, of the town hall, of the government of the village, to become the official stewards of the river. And that was an initiative just came out of this. They came together and say, now from now on, if you live in this village, you are the steward of this river. And you know that might seem a little thing, but the moment that you start looking and you start seeing a lot of these little things all around. So this is another example of a practical thing I think River King can make in practice. But for me, the most important is that this is through this participatory process that the ideas have to come out rather than us dictating them. And now you have the difficult part.
You know,
I'm going to come back to you, Julia, don't worry.
3 decades ago, when we launched the River Health Program in South Africa, I showed a slide. This was in the city of Pietermaritzburg. I showed a slide of the seals swimming gala in 1909 taking place in the river, which now, if you dangle your toe in there, it's going to drop off. It is so bad. But how do you know? So the concept of having wild swimming rivers, it's beautiful and it's fluffy, but how do you know if that river is safe to swim in? Indicators.
So Yara, are you happy that indicators can change things on the basis of that little story Chris has told you? And are you happy that Julia isn't just looking for some nice big slush fund for research? No, okay. Well, we might come back to those ideas. Stuart, I'm going to move on to you. UN Secretary General wants to make this a legacy issue, something that will redefine the world in some way, shape or form. So you need to make sure that your investment is a good one here.
Yeah, wonderful. First of all, thank you for making me the head of a UN agency.
You can buy me a beer later.
I'm really super grateful for that step up. And for giving me 50 million. Right, I have a couple of questions. I'm going to start with Chris. Chris, in your presentation, you know, I'm all for indicators too, but I think you left a few questions outstanding. It's great that we measure river health through biodiversity, but I would be very interested to know how you would go global with that and how you would want to compare one country's biodiversity with another country's biodiversity. Because I really think at a global level, when you're trying to influence global policy and dialogue, you need global status and trends. And I fear that what you've presented is just an idea that we need to go right down to the smallest thing in the smallest river without being able to get there. So that would be my question to you. And you have to bear in mind that with my 50 million, this is donor money.
You can't get the smile off
you
your
know,
face, can you?
I'm needing to see some impact and some accountability there from you, Chris. So that was my question. And then Julia, I'm really warming to the Riverkin notion. I surprised myself a little even saying that. But I do have some questions. I have three questions. In this kind of era of post-truth, I just wondered if you could say how we can make these stories accurate. And then sort of linked to that, how could we be consistent on what healthy is just through stories? So if the health of one story, of one river, is not necessarily the health of another. And lastly, if we were to sort of invest, and I'm really reluctant to release the money that I have, but if we were to invest in this idea, how would you, through stories, prioritize one river over another river?
So, thank you, Dragan. So, there's quite a lot of science out there already on what they call the normalization of data, where basically, even though biodiversity in different areas is vastly different, you normalize it by converting it onto an equal scale. So, for example, you can describe what should be there as the natural biodiversity, and then you have an indicator measuring how far you're deviating from natural, and that measure becomes the normalized indicator, which can be used all over the place. So there also are diversity indices and so on. There's plenty of tools out there to represent local biodiversity at a global level. You can also use keystone species and so on, but that's a lot more dangerous. And by the way, one of the easy routes that people adopt is to implement monitoring of red data species. It's not enough. There are very, very few red data species when you look at it at a global level. Many rivers you'll go and there won't be any whatsoever. So what does that mean? Is the river completely dead because there are no red data species there? So it's really important that you monitor the holistic biodiversity.
And yes, so actually, before I answer your questions, too, I think I'm going to throw a lead here with Chris, because in the River King idea, obviously everything also is localized as well. Has this, the specific people with the specific river that matter. So in that sense, we are together on the importance of looking at this smaller scale. And there was two questions. The first one, I think it was, how do you know if a river is healthy? And obviously, Dave wanted us to be a little bit like pitching against each other, but I think we acknowledge that it's not, you're not going to solve this just with the stories, just with the River King. So what I'm suggesting is not that we replace the indicators with the stories, that we replace the overarching narrative that we have around treating rivers as a thing, and reigniting, relating us to them as king. And within that, then of course the indicators will be important in order to, if you're going to tell the people, go and swim and embrace your brother the river, but you don't want to kill them, right? If the river is not good condition. But what I'm arguing is that I don't think we can just pretend that we can keep the story. So that's why one drive, which should include, is this healthy enough, is this in good enough condition for people to swim or for people to drink? There was also the other question. I was fascinated by your question about in this moment of post-truth or whatever it is. That is a fantastic question, and this is this is the thing that terrifies me, and I don't have a smart answer to this one, because this is the thing. I think probably one of the biggest risks that we all have now. We're here, we all agree, we are nice, sensible, intelligent people, but there is a wall outside that is ready to do, you know, what stories, you know, whose people and whose stories. So I don't have a good answer for you, because I think that is the question that freaks me out really about this. So I think that's a big one. So you forgive me on that one, but I think the importance that if we're genuine in our processes of working with the people locally, nothing can replace the fact that you're having those conversations with the real people in the real ground. So I guess there's a little bit of an answer on that. And your final point about how do we prioritize rivers? Do we have to? I mean, what a river in a place, because it has certain kind of indicator set, is still a river of a place of certain people. So are you going to tell them that they don't matter, that their river don't matter? If that river is their brother, it does matter.
My sense is that we've got a little bit of skepticism among our dragons, and that our entrepreneurs perhaps need to make a slightly firmer case for investment yet. So we're going to continue this conversation, but just before we do, I want to ask you to start thinking about questions that you'd like to ask or comments you'd like to offer, and that includes anybody who's listening online or engaging with us online as well. We will come to you for your thoughts shortly. We want to pick your brains as well. Anyway, back to that skepticism. Alan, I fear I might have cut you off in your prime earlier. I had the sense that you might have had a few more things you wanted to drill into.
Yeah, thank you for this. And yeah, I'll start back with Chris. I'm curious from your perspective. You know, we have a lot of data. You know, we're in the era of big data and in this era now. And from your perspective, I'm curious, like how much more might we gain from, you know, this investment and more data, and from your work and that you've done and others in this field, I'm wondering if you could give some examples of insights that we might have gained from having more data, and how that might, you know, translate to action and impact in this space.
It's really interesting when you look at our present time. There's a lot of global energy to report at a global level. We've got the SDGs, the CBD COP is in October, and the CBD COP, for example, they're trying to set in place indicators for monitoring biodiversity globally. And again, it would be easy just to fall onto those simple ones that you can monitor with Earth observation, but the nettle that you have to grasp is that you have to then bring in the local-based stuff. So there's an appetite out there. There really is an appetite out there for us to understand what's happening around the globe. We simply don't have the data. So I think the market is there. We need to actually provide that data, and at the moment, it's missing. The initiative to pull it together is missing.
Chris, let me just question that a little bit, because one of the stories you've told me, and I hope I'm not oversharing here, is that during some of your work with some of the sort of country representatives during the development of SDG 6 monitoring schemes, there was data there, but the countries didn't want to use it. They didn't want to use certain indicators. So tell me a little bit about how politics might get in the way of your big idea, and how you might get round some of those political obstacles.
Well, that's always an issue. So, you know, with the SDGs, for example, countries signed on to actually be part of the SDG program. But then if they decide to withhold information, and it does happen, and countries also manipulate the data that they present on the global stage. But hopefully those are the minority, and we really just have to keep working at a global governance level, trying to make sure that people are being honest about what they're reporting.
So we just do it anyway?
Well, I think for the bulk of the world it'll work. Some countries might be obstructive.
Okay. Panel, I'm going to open it up to you now.
So just one thing is that's one of the amazing role that NGOs and so on can play, because very often they go in and can undermine a government's efforts to hide things, especially things like biodiversity. Water quality is a bit more complicated because you need to collect samples and so on, but NGOs are really good about reporting on biodiversity.
Okay. Who among our dragons feels that all their concerns have not yet been addressed? They're not yet ready to make decisions about investments? Yara.
Well, as the position I am, I have to looking for the multiple uses for the water resources. In that sense, I'm still not secured about how your proposals connected with the other uses of the river basin. For example, how can I bring on board the users, the stakeholders from the agriculture sector, from the hydropower sector, from the river transportation sector? How can I bring all this together? Have you think about a broader strategy that how your propositions can fit, and also looking for their interests while considering yours as well?
Just, yeah, by asking them to tell their story. So you bring them and say, what is your story? What's what you need from this river? What are you using it for? What does it mean to you? Listening to them and finding the intersection of the multiple stories of your multiple stakeholders, and use that as this beginning of, you know, the new thread that you're going to tell. So essentially, yeah, listening to their story.
You know, to give you one example related to agriculture, is that Johan Rockström, who's a local legend around here, he drafted a paper a couple of years ago where he redefined what sustainable intensification of agriculture is all about. And normally we sort of talk about sustainable agriculture as that you practice agriculture and you try to minimize the impact on the environment. And everyone knows that doesn't work, because that you always get the tail end of everything. The environment gets the tail end. So he flipped the whole thing around, and he said that you need to actually practice agriculture within the capacity of the ecosystem to support it. And that's a completely different mindset. And you can only know that if the biodiversity is part of that ecosystem. Because remember, the biodiversity is the ecosystem. It is actually providing, it's supporting the entire functionality of the ecosystem. So agriculture cannot be practiced sympathetically with the natural environment unless you understand the biodiversity. So all of this needs to come together. And so, yes, agriculturists of old, you might have a hard sell. Agriculturists, the modern ones, it's much, much easier. And the same applies to all the other users as well.
Can I say something? What you have to say has reminded me of your analogy of the river health and the indicators. As we all know, when we're feeling well and we're feeling bad, we have indicators, you know, blood pressure and how are our kidneys and that. I think there's one piece missing in that analogy, that sometimes, you know, you go to the doctor and all the indicators are right, but you still don't feel well. There is something else that is wrong. There's the emotional part, the mental health, call it how you want it. So what I'm arguing for is that we do not replace now just with you know, this narrative around River King, is that we reconsider the definition of river health, so that all those indicators, my blood pressure, my kidneys, my whatever, and, you know, my emotional element, my emotional self, my mental health. So not replacement, but integrating that.
It really is important, and in a way this is where biodiversity is so good, because biodiversity integrates the whole lot together. If the biodiversity is okay, you can rest assured that the quantity of water and the quality of water and the habitat is actually okay. Because otherwise you do get these sort of completely unexplained issues. You know, like once I was in Peru, and they were monitoring the water quality with the basic set of indicators, and it was mint condition. And because of that, the government actually took the initiative and said, well, that's it. We don't need to give you any more money because the river's in good condition. It can look after itself. Meanwhile, the river was dead because it was full of copper that they weren't monitoring, because there were big copper mines upriver polluting the river, and it wasn't on their monitoring list. Whereas if they'd been monitoring the invertebrates and the fish, they would have picked it up like that. So biodiversity is very integrative like that.
Right, we're getting very dangerously close to agreement here. We can't have that. No joint ventures allowed. My sense from looking at the body language of our dragons is there's still a little skepticism, but we'll find out a little bit more about what they think later. What I'd like to do now is go to you guys in the audience. So, Lucy, have we got any questions or comments online at all? Not at the moment. Online friends, colleagues, get typing, please. What about in the room? Charlie Avis, if nobody else speaks, I'm going to come to you because you promised me you'd ask an awkward question. That'll get proceedings started. Yeah, please, to Charlie, and then we'll open it up again.
Thank you. Somebody has to start, right? Charlie Avis from Wetlands International. First of all, congratulations to all of you, because it's an absolutely gripping afternoon, and well done to all of you for thinking it up and for carrying it out so brilliantly. I'm with you, Laura. And, Julia. And my comment is this. To me, the most effective restoration initiatives, conservation initiatives, are when you've got a vision for what you want to achieve. And okay, visions can have some numbers there as well. But a vision is something that you look at. It's about your locality. You buy into it. You see, oh, yeah, that's where I live. That's where the storks live, and so on and so forth. So I say that you're on the right track here. And I say what we need is visions at river basin level and more locally. That's it. Thanks.
Okay. If Charlie has money, you've got a starter to your fund. Yes, please.
I'm also going to be awkward and have a comment rather than a question. Yes. One thing that we haven't really discussed.
Sorry, can you just say who you are?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, my name is Abby. I'm from a company called Aquawatch. We're based in New Zealand but work globally on water quality monitoring and storytelling. Because what we see, and I'm just going to preface this by saying I don't have a background in water quality. I'm from financial services. I don't have a background in global governance, but I do have 2 teenage boys. So what we do see through actually hundreds of thousands of continuous data points is that waterways tell their own story. If you're listening to them all the time through continuous monitoring, then they tell you when they're sick, and they tell you when they're sad, they tell you what they did on their holidays, and they also tell you when your grey infrastructure is failing, and they tell you the benefits of your nature-based solutions. So, I have a question, this is great. Why aren't we talking about the benefits of continuous monitoring allowing storytelling?
Who would like to pick that up? And I'm going to look at our dragons as much as our entrepreneurs here.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think maybe this is where the conclusion of the session was always going to head to some extent.
Not yet, Stuart. Not yet.
Sorry, we just rewind that. Yeah, I think the issue is that monitoring, for choice of a better word, bearing in mind if I take my new job away, it's just not exciting enough to tell those stories. And I think there needs to be something more exciting in that data to tell the story. Which made me think, Julia, of your presentation where you used the UK example of the rivers being polluted with sewage there. It's a bad story that caught the headline. And that made me also think, well, you know, as a sort of well-resourced, advanced nation, you need the politics behind that. So that story caught the headline and the action took place because it came to the politicians and they said, right, we've got to do something. But could that same thing happen in other countries which weren't so well-resourced or didn't have that kind of political mechanism behind them? Sorry, I've deviated slightly from your question, but I just wanted to add that one on when I had the mic.
Fair enough. I'm going to slightly abuse it. Oh, actually, before I do, anybody else want to contribute an answer or a response?
I just think it's great. Yeah, I think this is, I love the example of how, you know, these stories are coming through, and I completely agree we should be using it like that. So I just can only agree with that.
So I'm reminded of some work that's being done by a man called Simon Linker, who works for CSIRO in Australia, and he's big into acoustic monitoring of freshwater systems. And potentially that's a really sort of exciting way that you can literally listen to the changes in river health over time and in different parts of the system. I think there are all sorts of imaginative possibilities that can be done around that, including combining with the arts to, you know, add music to that, for example. So I think there's a lot more we could do in that space of using monitoring to tell a story. I'm not quite sure that addresses your continuous monitoring point, but one for conversations afterwards. Any other questions or comments? Oh, look at this. This is great. I'm going to go to Rebecca first, and then I'm going to try and remember who else had their hand up. Lucy, anybody else online yet? Okay.
Thank you, Rebecca Thorne, River Futures. I was interested in your thoughts on cultural health and integrating sociocultural health into the concept of ecosystem health. You know, in some parts of the world, those kinship relationships and those seeing rivers as kin is already well established. Many of the indigenous communities already operate with that sense of a lack of separation. There is no way of separating themselves from the river environment. So I think that's already in place in many cultural contexts. And in those places, there is leadership in terms of assessing river health through the lens of cultural health assessments. So I was just interested in the extent to which it might be feasible to bring both of those concepts together, the ecological indicators and then the kinship relationships and the health-related indices around that, many of which are integrated alongside ecological health indicators for river health. So they may be collected in a different way, but they often are integrated as one sort of sense of overall river health. Just an open question.
Anybody up here want to respond to that? Julia, you look like you're itching to say something on
I
that.
think, Dave, you're going to fail in your attempt to slow down the conclusion that we are reaching, which is that we need them.
I'm kind of getting that feeling.
I think this is happening. But I want to provide an example of which say, first I wanted to acknowledge very much that, you know, when I was talking about this themification, I was talking about, you know, I wanted to recognize that there is places in which still, you know, there's this very strong kinship relationship still. I just wanted to make the point that it's not just there. We can find the kinship everywhere. And I want to give another example from a case, again, in Spain, where I'm from. We have it's about Drying River Networks project. And in a little village in Spain, when we went there, and relating this to your comment about cultural health, one of the things that came more strongly in that research is how, because the river had deteriorated so much, we were being told by the local people that they didn't go there anymore. And you know, and they were saying, when I was little, I would go there, and there were turtles. I would go with my grandmother, and they really spoke as a breakage of intergenerational relationships, because there was no longer a space to do, you know, to spend the time together. So that was a harm that had been done to the cultural context of those people there. And just to comment on you, I think you said that there is a bad story in the UK headline. I think the UK is in catastrophic system failure. So it's not just that there was a bad story that caught the news, it's that it's so bad that, anyway, sorry.
Go, Chris.
I just wanted to actually go back to this comment about continuous monitoring, because there are indicators which are now being implemented for continuous monitoring. And you know, one that has been around for years is fish monitors, which they have on their inflow to waterworks. You have water going through a tank with fish in it, and if the fish start dying, you've got a problem. It's a canary in the coal mine kind of story. What we're doing right now, which is really amazing, we're building a digital twin in the Limpopo River Basin in Southern Africa. And what we've done is we've attached sensors to the backs of tigerfish. That fish that I had in my picture with the big teeth, they're big fish like this, and they're really strong swimmers. And we've then used machine learning to monitor monitor the normal behavior of the fish, and so that the sensors pick up the behavior of the fish, and they send it via the mobile phone network back to the lab 24/7. The minute the fish starts to behave strangely, either because it's getting agitated because the water quality is going bad, or it's going all torpid because the water quality is bad, or there's not enough water and its behavior changes, it sends signals through. And so the manager will get a WhatsApp message immediately saying, there's a problem, the fish are unhappy, or whatever, there's a problem. And then he can then go to try and find out why.
We had 2 or 3 more questions. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Asad. I'm working as a junior rapporteur for World Water Week. So it's a very interesting concept to learn about kinship of rivers. But in the context of ephemeral streams, like intermittent streams, how would you go about it? So if I think that I come from a city of 25 million people from Pakistan, and it has this river that people don't have a lot of stories about it. So there's no cultural connection. And we get water from a different lake, and it's not beautiful enough to swim in it. It's always polluted with plastic bags and all that. So there are no stories, there's no connection. So how would you go about it to establish that kinship, that connection that we want?
It's a very good question, but was there never a connection? You know, can we go back in time and find a moment where there was a connection before it was so polluted? Because it's a bit of the example I put in Spain. Now the connection was broken because the river was in bad. Essentially, it's an intermittent river, so it's dry all the time. So there is nowhere to go and sit there. So, but that was not always the case, right? There's a history of that transformation. So I think I will go about trying, and there will be a lot of, I guess, ways you could go around this, but one about these life stories of the people, the elderly people in there, can they still tell a story about how things were in the past? What would we need to do to reverse back to that connection? But it's a very good question. I guess that raised the question, are there points in which the level of disconnection has become so big that it's actually not possible to walk back? I think that's a very relevant question that we'll have to ask.
Let me pick that up. There's one of the criticisms in the conservation movement more generally is that we're continually accused of wanting to restore things to somehow how they were in the past, when the future is going to look different, the world has moved on. Isn't that just what you're trying to do? You're trying to recreate some arbitrary moment in the past rather than facing the future?
No, I think that was in answer to that question, what happens when now the situation is broken? So I was trying to say, can we reignite? Can we use the past to reignite present relationships? So I'm not suggesting that River King is about going back to healthy. I think that's absurd. We cannot do that. So that's why we carefully use the word reignite rather than just replace or even restore or go back, but reignite. I think you were saying rekindle. So
Yeah.
we should have used that
indeed,
one.
Indeed. There was a question here. Yes. And a couple of others, and then we'll see where we are.
Thanks so much. Kirsten Oliver, Wild Trust in South Africa. So I think everyone's pretty sure where this conclusion is leading to. But it actually points to one very important disjunct between the kind of more qualitative side of data and the quantitative side, is that we are taught at all levels of education that there's a very distinct difference. And quite often, you're not really, I mean, the education system doesn't allow you to cross over. So when I was at varsity, I studied speech and drama and geography, and every single exam that I had clashed because you're not supposed to. They're like one science and the other's like drama. You don't cross over. And I think for somebody who's looking at funding something, it's probably quite important to consider, how do you make the connection? How do you tell people who are coming through an education system now that are going to be our future storytellers and scientists in the same place? They're doing two functions technically. How do you bridge that gap now, where we've got hardcore scientists who don't know how to do that because they don't, and storytellers like my marketing department who don't know how to tell the numbers. They don't know, they don't understand it.
So I love this question. I think it's rather debatable whether geography is a science. I speak as a geographer. But anyway, I love the question.
It is probably one of the reasons why it's easier for me to tell the story.
Indeed.
Because it sits between.
So panelists, how do we completely reframe university teaching so we get more multidisciplinary experts who can do this stuff together? We've got about 2 minutes, by the way.
Yeah, I don't necessarily have the answer for this as someone that's gone through a lot of school. I started off with my undergrad as an undergraduate in engineering, civil engineering, and then did graduate school in public affairs, and my PhD is in integrating behavioral science into environmental programs. And so, without having someone to dedicate, their career to learning, I think there is some, programs that are out there that, seem to, try to teach, interdisciplinary programs and things like that, or more generalist types of education where you're getting a good mix of things in a discipline, or you spend part of your time here in one space of more of a qualitative, and then more in another in a quantitative, and you bring that together. But I don't know that I have a short answer in doing that, other than building that out early and in a longer term path, or just creating people that are curious and interested and just learn, like being able to think across spaces. So I don't know. I wish I had a more succinct answer than that. But,
the reason why I love the question is because it's something that I've been talking to academics about quite a lot, including Julia. I think it's something that's really urgently needed. And for me, having spoken to a few colleagues and a few academics in recent times about it, I think there's a lot that could be done at the doctoral training level. I know that's late in the process, but in doctoral training, I think there is scope to train people a little more in non-technical issues, how to use their research in the real world, but also to bring in slightly broader ranges of influence, slightly broader skill sets and knowledge bases as well. And that's something that I'm hopefully going to be doing a bit of work on myself. So maybe we could have a chat afterwards. Anyway, I'm not supposed to be talking too much here. Francesca had a question, and then another one at the back, and I'll see if I can fit in Shushi as well.
Thanks, Francesca from Wetlands International. I'm slightly undecided, okay, because in 20 years of practitioner, I've been using both, and you know, I'm not sure that they were effective in several occasions. So I have a question for Chris, which is to say, all those beautiful milestone studies that Dave was showing, right, the free-flowing rivers and water scarcity, so on and so forth, really milestone studies. Do you have a sense whether they have had an impact with practitioners, decision makers, politicians, and donors?
You say that's a question for Chris. I'd love to hear from all the panel on that, actually.
I must say I don't have any data to back it up. Yeah, I suspect. But certainly, you know, the fact that the global conventions and so on are taking them up, one would hope that they do contribute to the message which is getting out there. Yeah, sometimes I'm a little bit cynical from the point of view that at a local level, very often those global data sets are of little value. So they help with the global storytelling, but at the local level.
Anybody else like to contribute some thoughts on Francesca's question? Does all this clever science, these global analyses, do they make a difference? Yara, you've expressed some skepticism about this in the past.
Yeah, I'm afraid I have to agree with Francesca that I have seen these approaches before and I didn't see like big changes. I'm not saying they're not important. I'm saying we need to go further in how to use these to make changes on the ground. And in the sense, we have to involve the local communities and the data that the local communities have, and maybe using the story these people have and tell to bring this data on board and connecting the dots with the national level and then with the international ones. And I think this is what we're missing here on this proposition. I still miss this bridge connecting academic with the public policies. How do you make it? I think we don't have this profession yet. Who are the professionals which has the responsibility or the governance to connect what's produced in the universities to the public policies? We should create one because we're needing it. So I think you have a very great ingredients, but the recipe is not good yet. So I'm not convinced.
Okay.
I would give you, I don't know, a light maybe to tell you different. How would it be a headline of a famous newspaper confirming the positive impact of your proposals to the society? How would it be these headlines?
This is your elevator pitch, folks.
Yeah, just
So, what would be the headline of a famous newspaper confirming the positive impact of your purpose for the society in practical terms. What the newspaper would communicate in the headlines, in the first page, to say, aha, they did it.
Well, you know, to be on track to provide the evidence of how healthy or otherwise our rivers are.
Yeah, but, I mean, I don't have the perfect headline, but I think what the problem I see with what you suggest, Chris, is that we're on the way to, have the river health. I think that the real headline would be when, in my case, would be like kinship restored, and the people, communities and rivers thriving or something like that. That would be that would be very cheesy, I think, as a headline. But I think and I can see, we're not managing to convince you, Yara, but for me, there's been a couple of really revealing comments of something that for me would be a success of River King, is that rather than talking about how can we do what we're doing better, is what different we need to do. And you provided an example that we need to have educational programs that are bridging across. You said that we need a profession that bridge across between the academic and the public policy. Those are, to me, examples of trying to think about this thing different rather than let's try to improve our framework a little bit more. Let's try to be more detailed in this. Let's try to make sure that the data are well connected. For me, those are coping mechanisms, like improvements of the same model. And my argument was the model is broken. We need to find another model. And I love that you both provide the examples of things that are different. Maybe you didn't expect that you're going to have that as a suggestion coming out for specifically a session about river health. That we're going to say, well, we need to transform our university system, but maybe that is what we need to do. So I don't have the headline, but I think you both provided, and more people provided, beautiful examples of what River King can mean. So give me the money.
Clearly, one of the things that people need training in is writing newspaper headlines, because I'm not convinced either of those would sell newspapers. Apologies, we are running out of time, so I'm not going to be able to take any more questions. Sorry for being ruthless, but do come up and have a chat afterwards. Right, dragons, decision time. How would you spend your 50 million and why? Now, who would like to go first, or shall I just pick on someone? Stuart, you're looking ready.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Please be brief as well.
First of all, thank you very much to both entrepreneurs for putting your case forward. I found, surprisingly, actually, Julia, your case was very compelling. Chris, I found you a little skeptical. But I still feel that there's a need to invest in internationally comparable data, and I think biodiversity is absolutely the right way to go. It's something we haven't spoken about, which is, the national biodiversity strategic action plans, I think, are a very good bridge between allowing data to come in and a story to come in. They're not so rigid like the SDGs. I actually think that is a helpful way. So if you were to consider that existing avenue of kind of deploying your project and increasing the biodiversity representation of freshwater bodies and river health, I would say I'll give you 20 million. I'm going to hold a little bit back, if that's okay, Dave, because it's got maybe performance-related pay.
He's tough, isn't he? He's tough. He's getting into the role, that's what it is.
I was really, won over by the Riverkin idea. I do have some questions about its kind of operational, how it would become operational and practical. But I think, and like what's coming out from some of the audience, is that these stories have to be told, and it's politics almost. It's not just on a local level. It needs to be raised and told very well, so that we're hearing about river health all the time, and that's what I think could happen through this Riverkin project. So, without being too equal, I will give you 20 million, and I just want to hold a little bit back for.
That fence is very comfortable, isn't it?
Okay?
Okay, I get the sense that Yara might be a little more ruthless. Over to you.
I'm afraid so. So, Chris, I do think monitoring is very important, as indicators are, but I'm not sure yet how the idea of monitoring you bringing could change the game that we are, the model that we have already at the moment. But I'd like to give you a chance to prove me I'm wrong. So I would suggest that we choose like a small river basin, but it's still a significant one for you to show them how would you connect the data produced and the indicators produced in this river basin to the global level, like an experience to check if it is possible and how we could, if it works, maybe we could make it grow and take it to the State Council to be discussed further. So be a pilot project, if it's okay for you.
Can you put a number on that, Yara?
49 million.
No. As a public person, I have to be very responsible with the public money, and until I know, it's just financing an experiment. So I don't see how it can bring impact to the society or political gain for my superiors. So I would give you 10 million for a start.
I knew she was ruthless. Okay.
And Julia, I would offer you a similar suggestion to choose another river basin to check, is it possible that this new model that you are suggesting that we need would be able to work in a small scale? Because I have a personal experience that deciding where to have a dinner with like 15 people, it's impossible. Someone want to go for barbecue, one want to go for vegetarian, other go for an organic, and someone want to go for pizza, and we never have everyone on board. So if we're able to construct this model in a small scale, we can also talk further, okay?
Put a number on it, Yara.
Also 10 million.
10 million. These people sitting on fences.
30 million will be on the bank, like increasing, and then if you both of you succeed, then we talk further, okay?
Okay. Alan, last but by no means least.
All right. Thank you all for this session. I have to say I came in, I was quite biased towards the concept of narrative, and I've been influenced even by your comments here. So I think for me, I would say, Chris, I would go with 15 million. I think that the data collection and understanding of river health is obviously critical to understanding where we prioritize our times and our effort, and just having a sense of, where we would spend our time. But I think I wonder if at this stage that where we are, obviously in various parts of the world, that having a strong vision and narrative is a bit of a I think precursor to igniting some of this data collection and things, and working with communities to see this as a priority. And I also wonder if this concept of doing it globally and on a global scale will require a lot of effort and basins. And so I think it's going to be quite a bit of investment needed to get that off the ground, to have these kind of work together. So
how much investment?
35.
Finally, we have a dragon nailing his colors to the mast. Right. Okay, so lots of conditions on this, lots of things for our entrepreneurs to go away and think about, and I suspect some pretty hard negotiations to follow over a beer this evening. But as I make it, Julia now has 65 million quid. Dollars that she could go away and play with for her slush fund, and Chris has 45 million. So you could do something with that, I think. But of course, these aren't the only dragons in the room. There's a whole bunch of dragons as well. So back to Mentimeter, if we can. Right. And if we just leave that up there a moment, do the scanning thing. Lucy, if you could release the questions or move the slide on, or whatever it is you do on Mentimeter to enable people to answer. So there are going to be two questions on this. One is, how would you spend $50 million? And of course, we've given you two alternatives, something on indicators and data, something on narratives and storytelling. But there may be other options too. So you can allocate between 3 options. And if you do have other ideas of things we could do, we'd love to hear them. And that's what the second question's about. It's an open question. What else could we do as a community to raise the profile of river health and to generate action to improve river health locally and globally? We'll give that a minute or two. If we could move to the Mentimeter screen so we can begin to see the results. Oh, it's a close run thing. Well, there you go. There's a lot of fence sitters in this room, aren't there? But of course, the inevitable conclusion was that they're both important. We always knew that that was going to be the case. I was just kind of hoping there may be a little more discrepancy between them. There you go.
I'm curious, what are the, if anyone
what are the
something
something else?
Something else, yeah.
So let's move to the next screen, and if people have had a chance to answer the question on what is the something else, or what other things could be done, has anybody typed anything in? Somebody must have some other ideas. You just got it. Ah, okay. I should be patient. I can see lots of heads down, thinking, typing, or checking emails. Aha. Public mobilization and comms campaign. Systems approaches, systems thinking. Yes. People's science program. Restoration, awareness, rule of law. Crazy idea. It'll never work. Strengthening governance, coalitions. This is more like it. This is what we're on. We've got a couple of citizen science, people science things coming up. The continuous monitoring data. I wonder who put that up. It wasn't you. Okay, there's some good ideas here. Lots of things worth exploring. Sadly, we haven't left enough time for a proper discussion about all these things. Maybe we come back next year and reopen the discussion, or we can just stick around afterwards and have a conversation. I'm going to draw things to a close there because our time is up, but I would like to thank you all for coming, for participating. And of course, I would like to thank our entrepreneurs, Chris and Julia. You survived and you've got some money, so the beers are on you this evening. And our dragons, Yara, Stuart, Alan. Please give them a round of applause to say thank you very much. Thanks again for coming.